That politics remains the single most significant concept in the growth of a nation. Communicating political, economic and structural progress or lack of is just as important, as this is where the press comes in. The press is expected to keep the people informed of what is known about the current situation and as a result keep politics detailed, refined and important. Today, in most countries of the world, including Nigeria, this is not the case. In the recent Press Freedom Index from Reporters Without Borders, Nigeria fell 3 places below its ranking last year. And despite insistence of the government of President Muhammadu Buhari that the administration has delivered on press freedom, the rankings say otherwise. From fines to television and radio stations to what has been deemed as a means to gag the press through intimidation. The World Press Freedom Day will see us explore the current realities of Nigerian journalists and the place of politics. My guest tonight is Larry Arogundade, Director, International Press Center. One welcome to you, Larry, and thanks for joining us in Politics Headquarters.
Thank you very much for having me on your program. Good evening.
Good evening to you, Larry. Now, Larry, just recently, Nigeria was ranked 123 out of 180 countries in the 2022 World Press Freedom Index, compiled by Reporters Without Borders, a decline from 120 and 115 in 2021 and 2020, respectively. RSF also named Nigeria as one of West Africa's most dangerous and difficult countries for journalists to work in. My question to you is, do you agree with this assessment, and how would you describe the current state of media independence in Nigeria?
Well, I think the assessment is fairly accurate, and it reflects the reality on the ground. For example, whereas in 2021, the International Press Center, through our Safety of Journalists Alert Desk, documented less than 50 instances of attacks on the media. In 2022, the incidents as recorded by our organization went up to 66, with many more perpetrators involved in terms of those who are responsible for all these attacks. So when you look at it on a comparative basis, you will discover that in 2022, we had an increase in attacks on journalists and other media professionals and media institutions as well. And so when they put together this as part of the Press Freedom Index, it affects the ranking of Nigeria in quite a negative way. And the surprising thing is that this is not supposed to be so, because consistently we've made the case that in a democracy, while it is true that press freedom is not absolute and journalists have responsibilities, we expect some application of the rule of law, even where you believe that the media or journalists have probably infracted on the ethics of the profession or commit whatever offense. But what we see is that people essentially take laws into their own hands, often making use of the law enforcement and security agencies. And we had a number of instances like that. I could cite the example of the publisher of Wiki Times, Haruna Mohammed, who on a regular basis had been detained simply because somebody felt defamed or libeled by what that person published. Whereas the right thing to do is to go to court or charge him to court or report him to the regulatory agencies. So these extrajudicial actions against journalists and the media is one of the reasons why we keep having this kind of negative rating. And talking about media independence, you see, the media landscape in Nigeria is very well liberalized. Under the military, we didn't really have the kind of explosion of the broadcast media that we have now. And so to that extent, we can say that we have media pluralism. But in terms of independence, I think there's a big question mark there, because that in itself raises the old question of ownership. And to what extent can we say the media is independent, where, for example, the broadcast media is still largely owned by federal and state governments. When you come to the private media, you have owners that have very, very open political interests. So these interests sometimes affect the level of independence that the media in Nigeria should enjoy.
We'll talk more on this independence during the course of our conversation. But just recently, President Muhammadu Buhari, in celebrating and felicitating with the Nigerian media on World Press Freedom Day, said his administration has kept the faith. He said, and I quote, "We have ensured that Nigerian journalists have unfettered freedom to practice their art," end of quote. Larry, what do you make of Mr. President's statement, and how has his administration performed when it comes to press freedom?
Well, it's expected that the government would beat its chest and say it's really done, very, very well. But I don't think we've been as unfettered as the president, puts it. That we've really had, a very, very, very free hand to do our work. If that were to be the case, we then won't have all these incidents that we've very well documented. You will recall that even when we had the COVID-19 lockdown, and the president in his broadcast then said, journalists should be allowed to do their work, which meant a recognition that we were frontline workers. But journalists were still molested. The work curfew was imposed. Some were arrested in Lagos and some other places, and their movement, curtailed. Apart from that, we also have some of the policies of the current government that has negatively impacted on media, freedom or press freedom, as a matter of fact, of freedom of expression. So you recall the other time too that we had the Twitter ban.
Yes.
And following that ban by the federal government, the National Broadcasting Commission went further to instruct the broadcast media to remove all their Twitter handles, to kind of deactivate their Twitter handles. When we know that the media make use of Twitter to disseminate information, to generate income, to generate revenue. Policies like that really hamper press freedom. So in a sense, I don't think the president is right to say that we've had unfettered freedom, because we have legislations that are used to assert press freedom. One of them is the Cybercrime Act and the Anti-Terrorism Act. Recall that a number of journalists, including Agba Jalingo, Jonas Abiri, Showore, the publisher of Sahara Reporters, had actually been charged under this terrorism law. And the danger in that is that the Anti-Terrorism Act allows the security agencies to detain somebody
for more than
without being
48
charged
hours.
for a period of exactly 3 months, and then it's renewable. So they could keep you there and then they renew it. I don't really think we've really enjoyed freedom the way the president, through his spokesperson, has actually described it.
Now, Nara, why is this press freedom important in a democracy like Nigeria? And do you believe that journalists in Nigeria are able to report freely and without fear of retribution for the government or all the powerful actors? Because when people do the comparison, they said, if you know where we're coming from the days of the military, and they always use that as a basis of comparison. So why is it important to have this press freedom?
I think it's very, very important. You need press freedom to be able to hold the elected leaders accountable to the people, to be able to, ask questions, to be able to, report issues of development. However, we face, a lot of threats. When you compare with the military, perhaps the major problem that the media had was against the federal military government as at that time. Well, we had instances where in some states journalists had problems, but our main, the major foe of the media then was, the federal government, and the journalists that were jailed or were tried by military tribunals or who ran into exile were those that the federal military government were after. But if you look at what the experience has been since 1999, it seems as if we face multiple enemies. At the federal level, you have the law enforcement agencies, the police, the army, who at different times had cause to assault, the media. The other time, Daily Trust reported issues about Boko Haram. They were shut down. Their editors were detained. But beyond that, we also have state governments, state governors, really behaving like emperors. In one instance in the eastern part of the country, a state governor declared 2 journalists, I think one from them was from Vanguard newspapers, as persona non grata in his state. So when you compare, really, in a sense, the situation has not improved. We can even say that statistically, it has worsened. Journalists were killed under the military. Journalists have been killed since we returned to civil rule. And so what are we saying? So sometimes some people would even say, what really is the difference? So if we are this passionate talking about press freedom, it's to the extent that we feel that things are not being done right. In any case, it's not about us alone. You asked me why is press freedom so important. Perhaps we can look at the theme of this year's World Press Freedom Day. We talked about shaping a future of rights, freedom of expression as a driver for all other human rights. So in other words, there's a connection between press freedom and the freedom that citizens can enjoy. And the basis for that is the fact that people have the right to know. In fact, the basis of press freedom laws, access to information, is just that the citizens have the right to know. And we cannot overemphasize that in this age of the internet, in this age of misinformation and disinformation. You need what we call the traditional, the conventional media, the broadcast stations, the radio stations, the televisions, the newspapers, the print, the online newspapers, to provide credible information. Because we're not what it's called citizen journalists. It is true that these days, anybody can use his mobile phone to pass out information. You can record an accident scene and put out there. But it's still the journalist, the professional journalist, who will be in a position to pick his or her phone, talk to the police PRO for information on, the cause of
and there's
the
still
problem, what the police are doing.
that gatekeeping and the authenticity of it, and also reputation. Because when people say, citizen journalists and all of that, and I ask a question, I throw it back at them. Would you allow a citizen doctor to treat you or citizen pilot to fly your plane?
It's a misnomer. It's not a name that we should accept, because, like you said, you don't have citizens lawyers. You may have a people's lawyer, a pro-people's lawyer, but you don't just say a citizen's lawyer. And we need to really educate the public about our profession, about what we do. Look at the National Assembly. You have journalists whose duty it is to report the National Assembly 24/7. They report there every day. They follow the motions, they follow the bills, they follow the debates. These journalists cannot do that. So the functions that we perform in terms of democracy are very, very important, are very, very weighty. I spoke about the fact that we sometimes run into problems with law enforcement agencies. Do people know that we have journalists who go with the military personnel to war fronts?
Yes.
I mean, during periods of insurgency,
with
because
them.
You want to get exactly, they're embedded, and sometimes some of them even they get caught in crossfire. Sometimes when the police are doing some raids at night on duty, they bring along with them crime correspondents, because they also want them to witness what we do. So citizen journalism cannot be a substitute to real journalism, and that is why we say it is important for us to know that press freedom is not absolute. We have social responsibilities. We have to be professional. We have to be ethical, but we need protection. Our legislations, our laws should be such that give us that freedom, because we also help the government. What tribes usually on social media would be one information, one rumor, or the other. But when people want to follow what is really going on, they tune in, to News Central, they listen to the news, and then they're able to form some opinion about what government is doing. So I would think that it is in the enlightened interest of our government, of those that we elect into office, to recognize the important role that we play as media and do everything possible to ensure that the press freedom situation in the country improves drastically.
And talking about improving the press freedom situation in Nigeria, I'm sure you would agree with me that one of the most important landmark legislations in this dispensation since return to democracy in 1999 has been the Freedom of Information Act 2011. How helpful has it been in facilitating the work of journalists and its important role of keeping government and its agencies transparent and accountable to the people? And how cooperative has the government been in meeting this freedom of information request that have been asked by civil society organizations, citizens, and also journalists?
Well, I think it's been quite helpful. We have a number of media institutions that have used the Freedom of Information Act to request for information and carry out investigative reports. We have some ministries, agencies, and departments of government that have complied with the provisions of the Act in terms of proactive disclosure of information. Like the example of National Electricity Commission. If you go to the website there, it's clearly stated there that they subscribe to the Freedom of Information Act, and that you request for information, they provide that kind of thing. The Office of the Attorney General of the Federation has also issued guidelines on compliance with the provisions of the Freedom of Information Act, while a number of trainings have also been carried out. Unfortunately, however, in the majority, ministries, departments, and agencies of government are not complying with the provisions of the Act. And I could give an example. According to Section 29 of the Act, all ministries, agencies, and departments of government are supposed to file annual returns on compliance with FOI with the Office of the Attorney General of the Federation, for them to be able to say, these are the requests that we received, this is how we attended to the request. A number of them don't comply with that. Now, when civil society organizations, the likes of SERAP and the others, now go to court to
compel them,
compel them to disclose information or to sue them for non-disclosure of information, it is the same Office of the Attorney General that goes to defend them. And we got a stage where at the level of what we call the open government partnership, which involves the government, the civil society, the media, and the Office of the Attorney General is also responsible for that. We actually told him one day, I said, it doesn't make sense. You are the custodian of FOI Act according to the law. Your office provides oversight. You had even gone to the extent of asking, providing guidelines for the ministries to comply. When they don't comply, don't go and defend them. Just tell them to go and comply with the provision so that you don't also spend taxpayers' money.
Exactly, going to court.
To defend what's ab initio is not.
If you had done the right thing in the first place, we wouldn't be in this situation. Exactly.
Exactly, they've done the right thing, by taking all these, steps. So I feel that when you look at the Freedom of Information Act, we're not yet there in terms of because if government institutions comply the way they should, we may not even need to request for too many information. Because the key thing there are two sides to the FOI, as we always say. You have the supply side, this is part of the government, and then you have the demand side. The supply side is all about proactive disclosure of information, and the Act is very detailed on how information should be stored, even in a way that they are not damaged. So if you are storing information electronically, it is an offense under the Act for you to willfully damage those stored information simply because you do not want to provide them. It says that every agency of government should publicly disclose the functions they perform, their personnel, the salaries that those personnel earn, and they should be in a conspicuous place, which means that if we go to the website of NNPC, for example, that website should be able to tell us 70% of what happens to NNPC, its income, its expenditure. That is what the Act says, really. So if we have that proactive disclosure of information, we may really not have to go there every now and then to say that we are requesting for information. But we must say that it's a measure of progress that Nigeria, at least in 2011, under President Goodluck Jonathan, became the second country in West Africa to have, a freedom of information law after Liberia, I think.
It's a positive step, but more needs to be done. Now, let's talk about the challenges faced by journalists in this profession. And when you talk to journalists, one of the things you hear is issues with remuneration for journalists. Salary arrears can reach several months or even years for journalists. So what are some of the effects of this on the profession, and what are some of the other challenges faced by journalists?
Well, welfare of journalists is also a press freedom issue, because we say, journalists should do this, journalists should do that, but the journalists who we expect to do all this also needs to be in the right frame of mind, in the right state of mind to be able to do his or her work professionally. And when we look at that, it is quite disheartening that you have media organizations that simply refuse to pay their journalists and give the impression that the employment they've given them, the identity card, is a license to do whatever.
They say that there's a saying that, where you work is where you eat. Your work is your workshop or something like that.
Yes. Exactly. So it exposes, such acts exposes journalists to compromise because it becomes a matter of survival. If, for example, during elections, you ask your journalists to cover the campaign activities of certain candidates, could be governorship candidates, presidential candidates, and you don't provide, for their movements, for their vehicles, for their lodging, you are invariably saying that the candidate they should cover, the candidate should ask critical questions. This same candidate is paying for them. That in itself has actually, negated the whole essence of, providing that kind of coverage. So with that in itself is a major, problem. The media in Nigeria is in economic dire straits. Well, everybody complains about the economy. Businesses are suffering. The media is very, very hard hit. And we've always talked about the need for us to really look inwards. What are those incentives that the government could provide for the media to survive in terms of the enormous responsibilities that we carry? It is not everything we did during elections in terms of voter education, for example, that was paid for. These are services that the media render. So for me, you are raising a very, very critical and important issue when you talk about the welfare, of journalists, because in itself is a press freedom issue. So when we talk about press freedom violation, it's not only when a policeman harasses a journalist or a political thug harasses a journalist. A publisher or an employer of labor in the media that doesn't care that his or our journalists have not gotten paid for 6 months or 1 year, is also violating the rights of those journalists.
Because it does hinder
you, press freedom.
It hinders journalists from performing their duties, and it does expose them to a certain susceptibility to corruption.
It does, yes. And in some cases, even when some of them don't go and ask for brown envelope or take bribes, they just simply don't do thorough work. So they could just, a journalist who does not have the means to go around and do interview could just go online, scout what others have said, and then put it together as a story. So those such things itself affects the credibility of information, that comes out from the media.
Now, Mr. Arogundade, just before we begin to wind down and wrap up this conversation, what are organizations like yours, the International Press Center, and civil society organizations doing to put pressure on the government so as to ensure media professionals are protected from harassment and attacks, and those responsible for such acts are held accountable?
Okay, well, one of the things we do, I already talked about that, documenting the attacks, bringing such information to the attention of the authorities so that they could do something about them. But beyond them, we've also had a we have had series of engagement with those in government because we need them. Last year, we had a conference, for example, in Abuja that brought together media organizations, press freedom organizations, where we were talking about the possible development of a national mechanism for the protection and safety of journalists. The conversation and the thinking within our ranks has also gone beyond that. We are already looking at the possibility of a national policy on safety of journalists, protection of journalists, and press freedom. And when you talk about national policy, it's something that has to be owned by multi-stakeholders, the government itself, the media organizations, the media professional bodies. We're hopeful that if we're able to do this, there will be we can have some synergy, and then possible agreement on how we could go forward. But apart from that, in specific instances, we've also had some engagements that are yielding positive results. So in the last elections, we talk to the place, we raise issues. What can journalists do when they run into problems? And then they establish their own situation room, gave us the contact numbers of police officers on election duty that journalists could reach should they be exposed to danger or should they have one problem or the other. So these are some of the steps that we're taking. But beyond that, really, it's also the need to build the capacity of journalists and other media professionals on safety consciousness. Because sometimes we could be careless, and your carelessness could cost you a lot. So it means that we need specialized trainings. Sometimes these trainings involve experts in security, health experts, psychologists, psychiatrists who could talk about, trauma, because in the course of our work, we're sometimes exposed to traumatic situations, like it happened during COVID-19, like it happens during riots, wars. Some of these things have effects in the aftermath, on journalists. And so today, one of the things we did at International Press Center is to say, okay, we've been having safety alert desks, we'll be documenting. Let's really have a center center on safety of journalists that will do more of this work on a very, very systematic and strategic basis. And we hope that if we do that, and we are fortunate also to be able to have this national mechanism or national policy, I'm hopeful that in the next couple of years, the press freedom situation in Nigeria, should improve. So it means that we are all involved. We're looking forward to also engaging the incoming 10th Assembly to agree with us on the need to review some of the laws that tend to hinder press freedom, in the country. Because some of these laws, some of these media laws, were actually products of military rule. They were enacted with the military mindset, which does not allow questioning, which is like a command system from top to bottom. So if you look
there's
at
still work that needs to be done with regards to law. Because we're fast running out of time, I'll just like us to wrap up with this, Mr. Arogudade. When you look at young journalists, mass comm students in universities, a lot of them are not very hopeful of continuing in this profession. They feel there's no money there. And when you have young people show interest in journalism, they tend to go towards entertainment because they think that is the money spinning side, and it's soft and it's very glamorous. So how do you take care of the death in hard news? How do you encourage young people to say, look, it's a glorious profession. It could take you to places in life. And finally, on this occasion of World Freedom Day, what message would you like to send to media professionals in Nigeria, and how can they contribute to building a stronger and more independent media sector in the country?
Well, for the upcoming journalists, including maybe those who are still in school, mass communication students, journalism students, I want to say that the profession is much, much better off when you compare with, with the past. If only the fact that you have better resources to do your work now. When we started journalism, we didn't have all these recording gadgets, or we don't have the luxury of reaching people in government through WhatsApp, through email,
Yes.
Twitter, and so on and so forth. So looking at the tools of our trade, I think they give you greater opportunity. We also have a kind of explosion of the media landscape. Like I said earlier on, we have many more broadcast media, online media, then the international media who are looking for very, very good hands. And my message to them really is that if you are passionate about this job, if you are professional, despite some of these challenges that we've already enumerated, the sky could actually be your limit, really. I mean, you could earn, you can earn what other journalists might not have earned in 5 years, in 2 to 3 months, because many international news organizations are looking for that good journalist. So my message really is, be that good journalist. Now, for practitioners, those of us who are there and who have been there for some time, I also want to say that, look, let's know that our profession comes with weighty responsibilities. I know we are passionate and there's nothing wrong, because as journalists, as individuals, we have our opinion. We know what is going on. And so when election time comes, we have this feeling that, this person should be president, that person should be president. But like I used to say, please, no matter what our biases are, when it comes to this job,
keep them aside.
when it comes to election time, our political party is journalism. Then Nigeria is a multi-ethnic society. And we saw how elements of religion, elements of ethnicity or nationality kind of crept in and even played out during the last elections, to the extent that you had ethnic profiling threats and so on. We practitioners should strive to live above that, and also consider the fact that our tribe is journalism, because ultimately it's also a defense weapon for us when it comes to press freedom. I believe the more professional we are, the more ethical we are, the more we're going to have the support of the people. And even when we come under attacks, the people will speak for us and say, no, the media, they are doing a lot and they need to be protected.
Okay.
I do not think we have that level of public confidence that we should have. And we must try to win public confidence.
Quite a lot is still left to be desired. On that fine note, I would like to say a very big thank you to you, Larry Arogundade, President, Director, I beg your pardon, International Press Center. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you. Thank you for your time, contribution, and your insights.
Thank you very much.